I didn't think I would die at school that day, but I remember exactly how small her hand felt in mine when I decided I wouldn't let go. Emily Carter had stayed late again grading papers under the soft hum of fluorescent lights. The hallway outside her classroom stretched quiet and empty, the kind of silence that usually felt peaceful, but tonight it felt off, like the building itself was holding its breath. She checked the clock. 5:42 p.m. Too late for students, too early for the janitor to start his rounds. She gathered her things slowly, listening to the faint echo of something distant, a sound she couldn't quite place, until it came again, sharper, closer, not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. Her heart stuttered. She stepped into the hallway, and that's when she saw Sophie Moretti standing near the lockers, small shoulders stiff, wide eyes fixed on something beyond the glass doors at the end of the corridor. "Sophie?" Emily called softly, but the girl didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there like a statue caught between seconds. Emily followed her gaze, and everything inside her tightened. There were shapes outside, movement too fast, too deliberate, and then the air shifted, the kind of shift that makes your body react before your mind understands, and suddenly every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out, to hide. But Sophie didn't move, and that changed everything. Emily dropped her bag. It hit the tile with a dull echo. She didn't remember crossing the distance. She only remembered reaching for the girl, pulling her close, feeling the fragile weight of her against her chest. "It's okay, I've got you," she whispered, though her voice barely sounded like her own. The world outside blurred into motion, into noise, into something dangerous and uncertain. But inside that moment there was only one decision, one truth. She tightened her arms around Sophie, turning her body, shielding her, guiding them both down toward the cold floor behind the row of lockers. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, loud enough to drown out everything else. She pressed her cheek against Sophie's hair, eyes squeezed shut, not from fear, but from focus, from the fierce need to make herself a wall between the child and whatever was coming. "Don't look, just stay with me," she murmured, and Sophie's fingers clutched her sleeve, small, trembling, but trusting, and that trust hit harder than anything else, because Sophie didn't know why this was happening, didn't know who was coming, didn't know that her life was different from the other kids, that somewhere out there a man with power enough to reshape cities would burn the world down to keep her breathing. But Emily didn't know that either. She only knew that this girl was hers to protect in this moment, and that was enough. Everything slowed, her breathing, her thoughts, the edges of reality narrowing, until there was nothing but the weight in her arms and the promise she made without words. "I won't let anything happen to you." I could feel her heartbeat against my ribs, fast, uneven, like a bird trapped in a cage, and for a second I wondered if she was more afraid than I was, or if she was just better at hiding it. The hallway smelled like cleaning solution, and something else, something sharp, that did not belong in a place meant for children. I kept my arms locked around her, my body curled just enough to cover her head, my shoulder pressed against the cold metal of the lockers, counting my breaths, because it was the only thing I could control. 1, 2, 3, slow, steady. Do not panic, do not move, do not let her feel it. Sophie's fingers tightened in the fabric of my sleeve, and I felt her face turn into my chest, hiding and trusting in a way that made my throat tighten. "You are okay, I am right here," I whispered again, softer this time, more for me than for her, because the words felt like something solid, something I could hold onto. The sounds outside shifted, not louder, not closer, just different, like a storm changing direction. And then there was silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that feels heavy, like it is waiting for something to happen. I opened my eyes slowly, just a fraction, enough to see the edge of the hallway, the glass doors at the end still intact, but reflecting movement, shadows stretching across the floor, too controlled, too precise. My instincts told me this was not random, this was not chaos, this was something organized, something intentional, and that realization made the situation feel even more unreal, because nothing about this belonged in an elementary school. Sophie moved slightly, her breath hitching. "Miss Carter," she whispered, her voice so small it almost disappeared before it reached me. I tightened my hold, gently brushing my hand over her hair. "I am here, do not worry," I said again, even though I could not promise anything beyond this moment, beyond this breath, beyond the fragile space I was trying to hold together for her. Time stretched in a way that made seconds feel like minutes and minutes feel like something endless, until suddenly there were footsteps, not running, not rushed, steady, measured footsteps echoing down the corridor toward us. My muscles tensed instinctively, every part of me ready to shield her again if I had to, even though I did not know what was coming next. The footsteps stopped just beyond the lockers, and I felt rather than saw the presence of someone standing there watching, assessing the air. Changed again, not chaotic, not threatening, just heavy with something I could not name, and then a voice low, calm, controlled, "Step away from the child." It said, not loud, not aggressive, but with a weight that made it impossible to ignore. I did not move, not at first, my arms still wrapped around Sophie, my mind racing through every possible outcome, every possible mistake I could make if I let go too soon, if I trusted the wrong person. "Identify yourself," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though my heart was still racing against my ribs. There was a pause, a brief silence that felt deliberate, like he was deciding how much to say, and then the same voice answered, "Someone who does not miss twice." The words were simple, but they carried a certainty that made the tension in my shoulders shift, not disappear, just change. I slowly loosened my hold just enough to look up, and that was when I saw him standing at the end of the lockers, tall, composed, dressed in dark clothing that fit him too perfectly to be accidental. His eyes moved from me to Sophie, and in that single glance something in his expression changed, not softer, not warmer, just sharper, more focused, like the entire world had narrowed down to the child in my arms. And for the first time since this started, I felt it clearly. This was not over, not even close. This was only the moment everything began. I did not know his name, but I knew immediately that he was the kind of man who did not repeat himself, and somehow that mattered more than anything else in that moment. I shifted slightly, keeping one arm around Sophie, while pushing myself up just enough to face him fully, my body still angled between them, a barrier that I was not ready to lower, not yet, not until I understood what he was to her, and what he wanted from us. His eyes did not leave Sophie, not even for a second, and that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke again. There was no panic in him, no confusion, no relief, just certainty, like he had already calculated every possible outcome, and chosen this one long before he stepped into this hallway. "You can let her go now," he said, his voice quieter this time, not softer, just controlled, like he was adjusting to the situation rather than reacting to it. Sophie shifted in my arms, her fingers loosening slightly, as if she recognized something I did not. "Sophie," I whispered, feeling her hesitate, and then slowly she turned her head just enough to look at him, and the change in her was immediate, not dramatic, not obvious. But there, her shoulders relaxed a fraction, her breathing steadied, like she had been holding something in, and finally let it go. "It is okay," she said so quietly, I almost missed it, and those two words did more than anything else could have. I felt my grip loosen before I consciously decided to release her, not fully, just enough for her to move if she wanted to, and she did, stepping forward carefully, her small hand slipping out of mine, and reaching toward him without hesitation, without fear. He stepped closer, closing the distance in two quiet strides, and when he crouched in front of her, everything about him shifted, not his posture, not his expression, but the energy around him changed, like the weight he carried was being redirected, contained, focused entirely on her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and for the first time, there was something else in his voice, not weakness, not vulnerability, just something more human. Sophie shook her head, her eyes still fixed on his face. "Miss Carter stayed with me," she said, and I felt his gaze lift, then finally meeting mine fully, and it was not gratitude that I saw there, it was assessment, recognition, calculation, like he was placing me into a space in his world that I did not understand yet, but could already feel closing around me. "You should not have been here," he said, not to Sophie, to me, and the words hit differently than I expected, not an accusation, not even a warning, just a statement of fact, like he was acknowledging that my presence had altered something important. "She should not have been alone," I replied before I could stop myself, my voice steadier, now grounded by the simple truth of it. His eyes held mine for a second longer, and something flickered there, too brief to name, but strong enough to register, and then he stood again, straightening to his full height, the space around us shifting with him, like gravity had just reset. "We are leaving," he said, turning slightly, and that was when I noticed the others, not rushing and not chaotic, just their position with quiet precision along the edges of the hallway, watching, waiting, responding to him without words. One of them moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away, his attention flicking between me and Sophie, like I was now part of the equation, whether I wanted to be or not. "She comes with us," the man said, and it was not a question. I felt my stomach drop slightly, my mind catching up to what that meant, to where this was going. "I am her teacher," I said, instinctively stepping forward again, my hand finding Sophie's shoulder, grounding both of us in something familiar, something normal in a situation that was anything but normal. The man in front of me tilted his head, just slightly, considering, and then his gaze returned to Sophie before settling back on me. "And now," he said quietly, "you are someone we do not ignore." The word ignore stayed with me longer than anything else he had said, not because of the threat behind it, but because of the certainty it carried, like a door had just closed somewhere I could not see, and I was now on the wrong side of it. Sophie's small hand found mine again, instinctively, her fingers curling into my palm, and that simple gesture grounded me more than anything else in the hallway. She stays with me until her parents arrive, I said before I could second guess it, my voice firm enough to surprise even myself. The man's expression did not change, but something in the air tightened, like I had stepped into a line I did not know existed until I crossed it. Her father is already here, he replied, and for a second I did not understand, not fully, not until my eyes shifted back to the man standing in front of Sophie, the way the others positioned themselves around him, the way the hallway seemed to organize itself without him moving, the way no one questioned his presence or his authority. And that was when it clicked, not just a realization, but a shift in perspective that made everything from the past 10 minutes rearrange itself in my mind. The precision, the calm, the control. This was not someone responding to a situation. This was someone who owned it. Sophie stepped closer to him, her hand slipping from mine without hesitation again, and I felt it this time, not fear, not loss. Just the quiet understanding that I was no longer the one she was holding on to. He looked down at her for a brief moment, then back at me, and I saw it clearly now, the connection, the reason, the way she trusted him, without question. You are her father. I said, the words coming out slower than I intended, like my mind was still catching up to my voice. He did not answer immediately, did not confirm or deny, just held my gaze in a way that felt like an answer anyway. I am the one who decides what happens next, he said instead. And it was not the same thing, but it was close enough. Sophie looked back at me, then her eyes, softer now, calmer, like the storm inside her had already passed. Miss Carter can come with us, she said, and there was something in her tone, not a request, not exactly, more like a statement of fact, like she had already decided and expected the rest of us to follow. It surprised me how quickly the man considered it, how his eyes shifted between us, calculating something I could not see, before settling again. For now, he said, and those two words changed everything again, because they implied time, they implied continuation, they implied that whatever this was, it was not ending here. One of the men stepped forward, slightly opening space toward the exit, and I realized we were moving before I consciously agreed to it, my feet following the direction they set, because standing still no longer felt like an option. The hallway that had felt so familiar just minutes ago now felt distant, like I was walking out of something I would not be able to return to. Unchanged, the glass doors opened before we reached them. Someone already. They're already anticipating, and the outside air hit differently, cooler, sharper, carrying the faint hum of engines waiting in a line of dark vehicles that did not belong in a school parking lot. Not like this, not like they had been placed here with intention. Sophie stayed close to his side, now her hand in his, like it had always been there, and I found myself walking just a step behind them, not invited, not dismissed, just included in a way that felt more dangerous than either. As we approached the nearest vehicle, the man paused just long enough to glance back at me once more, and there was no softness in his expression, no gratitude, no reassurance, just recognition, like he had made a decision about me and was now moving forward with it without explanation. You should not have stepped into this, he said quietly, and I knew he was not talking about the hallway anymore, not about the moment, not about Sophie. He was talking about everything that came after, and the strange thing was I did not feel regret. I felt something else, something quieter but stronger, like a thread had been pulled tight between my world and his, and neither of us had the power to cut it now. I did not remember agreeing to get into the car, but somehow I was already there, the door closing with a quiet, solid sound that felt more final than it should have. Sophie sat beside her father, now her small frame relaxed in a way I had not seen before, like whatever fear had lived in her earlier had dissolved the moment he appeared. And I sat across from them, my hands resting in my lap, trying to keep my breathing steady as the vehicle began to move smoothly away from the school, the world outside slipping past in blurred streetlights and familiar buildings that suddenly felt distant, like I was watching my own life from the outside. The interior of the car was silent, not tense, not awkward, just controlled, like everything here existed under rules I did not understand. Yet Sophie leaned slightly into him, her head resting against his arm, and he adjusted without looking down, like it was instinct, like it had been repeated 100 times before. And I found myself watching that small movement more than anything else, because it did not match the man I had seen in the hallway. The one who spoke in certainty and commands, this version of him was quieter, not softer, just precise in a different way. "You are not hurt," he said, suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. But his eyes were on Sophie, not me. She shook her head lightly. "Miss Carter stayed with me," she repeated, and this time there was something stronger in her tone, like she was making sure he understood not just what happened, but what it meant. His gaze shifted, then finally landing on me again, and I felt it the same way I had before, that careful assessment, like he was measuring something intangible, something beyond what I had done. "You acted without hesitation," he said, and it was not praise, not exactly, just observation. "She needed someone," I replied quietly, because anything more felt unnecessary, anything less felt dishonest. He held my gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, like that was enough, like the explanation aligned with whatever conclusion he had already reached. Outside the city continued as normal, cars passing, people walking, unaware that inside this vehicle something had shifted in ways they would never see. I realized then that no one had asked me where I wanted to go, no one had given me a choice about any of this, and strangely, I did not feel trapped, not yet. I felt something else, something more uncertain, like I had stepped into a current that was already moving too fast to resist. "Where are we going?" I asked, finally breaking the silence that had settled again. One of the men in the front seat glanced back briefly before returning his attention forward, but it was him who answered. "Somewhere you can be safe," he said, and the word safe lingered in the air between us, heavier than it should have been, because it implied danger, it implied continuation, it implied that whatever had started at the school had not ended when we left it behind. I shifted slightly, my fingers curling together unconsciously. "I have a home," I said, not as a protest, but as a statement of fact, a reminder to myself more than anything else that I had a place outside of this world. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable, before responding, "Not tonight," and that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a decision stated like it did not require my agreement. Sophie's hand reached across the seat, then small and certain, finding mine again and squeezing gently, and I looked down at her, surprised by the gesture, by the quiet reassurance it carried. "It is okay," she whispered, echoing the words I had given her earlier, and something in my chest shifted at that, the reversal of it, the way she was now offering me the same anchor I had tried to be for her. And for the first time since stepping into the car, I realized this was no longer just about what I had done. This was about what came after, what I had become part of without realizing it. And as the city lights faded into darker, quieter streets, I understood one thing clearly. I had not just protected a child that day, I had stepped into a world that was already closing around me, and the man sitting across from me had already decided I was not leaving it unchanged. The car slowed, gradually, the motion shifting from smooth speed to controlled stillness, and when it finally stopped, I felt it before I saw it, that subtle change in atmosphere, like we had crossed into a space that belonged entirely to him. The door opened, without anyone reaching for it, from the inside, and cool night air slipped in, carrying the faint scent of something clean, something distant from the noise of the city. I stepped out carefully, my shoes touching polished pavement that reflected soft golden light from above, and when I looked up, I realized we were not at an apartment, not at a house, not anywhere ordinary. This was something else entirely, something designed to be both seen and hidden at the same time. Tall glass windows framed the front of the building, but there were no signs, no names, nothing that explained what it was. Only presence, only control. Sophie moved ahead of me, her hand slipping back into his like it belonged there naturally, and I followed a step behind again, not guided, not forced, just expected to keep moving. The doors opened before we reached them, silently revealing a space inside that felt impossibly calm compared to everything that had happened earlier. Soft lighting, clean lines, quiet footsteps echoing against marble floors that seemed too perfect to belong to a real place. I hesitated for just a second at the threshold, not because I wanted to turn back, but because I knew crossing it meant something more than entering a building. It meant stepping fully into whatever this was, and leaving behind the version of my day that had started in a classroom. "Come," he said without turning, and it was not an order, not exactly, but it carried enough weight that my feet moved before I could question it. The inside was warmer, quieter, insulated from the outside world in a way that felt intentional, like nothing reached in here unless he allowed it to. Sophie released his hand, then moving toward a seating area where someone was already waiting, a woman dressed in neutral tones who immediately knelt to meet her at eye level, checking her gently, speaking in a calm voice that blended into the background like everything else in this place. I watched as Sophie responded normally, calmly, like this was routine, like being brought here after something like today was just part of her world, and that realization settled into me slowly, heavier than anything else, because it meant this was not an exception, this was normal for her. She will be taken care of, the woman said, standing again, her attention shifting briefly to him before returning to Sophie and guiding her gently away toward another room. Sophie glanced back, once her eyes finding mine, and she gave a small nod, like a promise, like reassurance, and then she was gone. The space she left behind felt larger than it should have, like something important had just been removed, and I stood there unsure of what I was supposed to do next until his voice cut through the quiet again. "You should sit," he said, and I realized then that I was still standing near the entrance, still holding tension in my shoulders that I had not released. Yet I moved slowly toward the seating area, lowering myself onto the edge of a chair, my hands resting in my lap again, a familiar position, grounding in its simplicity. He remained standing for a moment, watching me, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something to settle before continuing. "You are not here by accident," he said finally, and I looked up at him, the words catching my attention immediately, because they were not what I expected, not a question, not an explanation, just a statement that implied intention, that implied choice. "I did not choose this," I replied quietly, because it felt important to say it, to remind both of us that I had not walked into this world willingly. He studied me for a second longer, then took a step closer, just enough to shift the space between us, not threatening, not overwhelming, just present. "No," he said calmly, "but you stepped into it anyway." And there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not about blame, not about regret. This was about consequence, about the line that had already been crossed and could not be undone. I felt my breath slow slightly, my mind catching up to the reality of it, to the weight of what had already happened. "What happens now?" I asked, because that was the only question that mattered anymore, and for the first time since I met him, his answer came without pause, without hesitation, like it had been decided long before I ever asked. "Now," he said quietly, "you stay where I can see you." The words settled into the space between us, heavier than anything else he had said, not because they were loud, but because they were final. "You stay where I can see you." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to resistance, something that reminded me I still had a life outside of this building, outside of him. "That is not how this works," I said before I could stop myself, my voice calm but firm, the kind of tone I used in a classroom when I needed to be heard without raising it. He did not react immediately, did not interrupt, did not challenge, just watched me in that same measured way, like he was giving me space to finish, even though we both knew the outcome would not change. "I have a job, I have responsibilities, I cannot just disappear because of something that happened today," I continued, and for a moment I felt grounded again, connected to the version of myself that existed before all of this, the teacher, the person who made decisions based on schedules and obligations and normal expectations. He stepped closer, then not invading, not crowding, just enough to shift the balance of the conversation, like gravity had subtly changed direction. "You did not disappear," he said quietly. "You were placed somewhere safe." The way he said safe again made the word feel different, less like comfort, more like control. I shook my head slightly, my fingers tightening together in my lap. "You do not get to decide that for me," I replied, and this time I held his gaze without looking away, because it mattered, because if I gave that up, I felt like I would lose more than just this argument. Something flickered in his expression, then not anger, not frustration, something sharper, more interested, like I had done something unexpected, something worth noting. "I already did," he said, and there it was, simple, direct, unyielding, the kind of statement that did not leave room for negotiation. Silence followed, not empty, but full of everything unsaid, everything understood. I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax, even though the tension had not left my body. "Then explain it to me," I said, softer now, not weaker, just choosing a different approach, because pushing against a wall without understanding it would not move it. "Why am I here, really?" He watched me for a second longer, like he was deciding how much to give, how much I was allowed to see before answering. "Because you were seen," he said, and the answer did not make sense at first, not completely, until he continued. "You acted in a moment when most people would not. You made a choice without knowing what it meant, and that choice put you in a position where others will notice." The way he said others made something cold settle in the back of my mind, not immediate danger, not something I could point to, just awareness, the kind that changes how you move, how you exist. "So I am here because I helped a student," I said, trying to simplify it, trying to bring it back to something normal, something I could understand. "You are here because you became visible," he corrected, And that word visible carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it implied attention, it implied consequence, it implied that something had shifted not just in my world, but in his as well. I leaned back slightly, the chair grounding me as I processed it, the pieces aligning slowly, the hallway, the controlled response, the way everything had been handled without chaos, without confusion. This was not new to him, this was routine, and now somehow I had become part of that routine. And what happens when I leave? I asked, because that was the question that mattered, the one that determined whether this was temporary or something more. His answer came just as calmly as before, just as certain: you will not leave unprotected. And there it was again, not a request, not an offer, a decision wrapped in something that almost sounded like care, but felt like something else entirely, something heavier, something that settled into my chest and refused to move. Because for the first time I understood this was not about keeping me here, this was about making sure wherever I went I would not go alone, and somehow that felt even more permanent. The word protected did not feel like safety, it felt like a line drawn somewhere around me, invisible but real, and I sat there trying to understand how something that sounded like care could feel so much like control. You keep saying that like it is something I should accept, I said quietly, my voice steadier now, not because I was calm, but because I had moved past confusion into something sharper, something more aware. He did not look surprised by my response. If anything, there was something in his expression that suggested he expected it, like resistance was part of the process, not an obstacle to it. You should accept it because it is already in place, he replied, and the certainty in his tone made it clear this was not a conversation about options, this was a conversation about reality. I exhaled slowly, my fingers uncurling from where they had tightened in my lap, forcing myself to think instead of react, because reacting would not change anything here. I needed to understand the rules before I could even consider breaking them. Then tell me what that means exactly, I said, meeting his gaze again, because I refused to be the only one adjusting in this room. He watched me for a moment longer, then moved slightly, not closer, not farther, just shifting his weight like he had decided something. It means you will not be approached, it means you will not be followed, it means anyone who considers you part of this will reconsider, he said, and the way he listed it out made it sound simple, almost reasonable, but there was something underneath it, something unspoken that filled in the spaces between his words. And if they do not reconsider? I asked quietly, because that part mattered more than anything else. He did not answer immediately, but he did not look away either, and in that silence I understood that whatever the answer was, it was not something he needed to say out loud. You are asking the wrong question, he said finally, his voice lower, now more deliberate. The question is why they would take that risk at all. And there it was again, that shift in perspective that made everything feel different, not about what would happen, but about what would not be allowed to happen. I leaned back slightly, my mind catching up again, adjusting again, because every answer he gave seemed to move the ground beneath me just a little further from where I started. And Sophie, I asked after a moment, because she was still the center of all of this, the reason any of it had happened at all. His expression changed again, not softer, not warmer, just more focused, like her name carried weight even here. She will continue, as she always has, he said, and something about that answer unsettled me more than anything else, because I had seen what her normal looked like. Now I had seen what existed around it, what followed it, what protected it. That is not normal, I said before I could stop myself, and this time there was something in my voice, something closer to emotion, something harder to control. He did not correct me, did not argue, just held my gaze like he was letting me come to my own conclusion. No, he said simply, and that single word carried more honesty than anything else he had said so far. Silence settled again, but it felt different now, less tense, more grounded, like the edges of the situation were finally becoming clear, even if I did not like what they revealed. You said I became visible, I continued more quietly, now thinking through it out loud, because it felt necessary, because I needed to hear it to understand it. So, what happens when people realize I am connected to her? His answer came, without hesitation this time, like he had been waiting for that question specifically. They will not see you as separate anymore, he said, and the meaning of that settled slowly, heavily into my chest, because it meant exactly what it sounded like. It meant that whatever line existed between my life and his had already been crossed, not by him, not by Sophie, but by me. The moment I stepped forward in that hallway and chose not to walk away, I looked down at my hands for a second, then back up at him, and for the first time since this began, I felt it clearly, not fear, not confusion, something else, something quieter, But undeniable, I was already part of this whether I wanted to be or not, and the man standing in front of me had no intention of letting me pretend otherwise. For a long moment neither of us spoke, and the silence felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, just settled like something had reached its final shape, and there was no point pretending otherwise. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders finally lowering as the last piece fell into place. I could argue, I could resist, I could try to draw lines that made sense in my world, but none of that would change what had already happened. So this is it, I said quietly, not a question, not really, more like acknowledging something that had already been decided. He did not move, but his attention sharpened slightly, like the words mattered more than they sounded. This is where things change, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften it, just the truth stated plainly, and for the first time since all of this began. I did not push back, I did not argue, I just sat there and let it settle, because deep down I already knew it had changed the moment I stepped between Sophie and something I did not understand. I looked down at my hands for a second, then back up at him, and something inside me shifted, not fear, not acceptance, something in between, something steadier. Then I need to understand the rules, I said, and this time my voice was different, less reactive, more deliberate, because if I was already inside this world, then not knowing how it worked would be the real danger. He watched me closely for a second longer, and there was something new in his expression, not approval, not exactly, but recognition, like I had crossed some internal threshold he had been waiting for. You stay aware of your surroundings, you do not ignore what feels wrong, and you do not separate yourself from the protection that is put in place for you, he said, and the way he listed it made it sound simple, but I knew better. I knew each one carried weight beyond what was spoken, and in return, I asked, because there had to be something more than that. There always was. His gaze did not waver. In return, you continue your life, he said, and that answer caught me off guard, not because of what it was, but because of what it was not. He was not asking me to change who I was, not asking me to step deeper into his world, just asking me to exist within it differently. You expect me to go back to teaching tomorrow like nothing happened, I said, and there was a hint of disbelief in my voice that I could not fully hide. I expect you to go back, because that is where you belong, he replied, and the certainty in that statement grounded something inside me in a way I did not expect, because for the first time since this started, something familiar, something normal, was still mine. I studied him for a moment longer, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with everything I had seen, everything I had felt, and slowly the contradiction started to make sense. He was not pulling me into his world, he was placing something from his world around mine, like a boundary, like a shield I had not asked for, but could not remove. And Sophie, I said again, because she was still at the center of all of this, the reason I was sitting here at all. His expression shifted slightly at her name, not softer, just more focused like before. She will remember that you stayed, he said, and that answer lingered longer than I expected, because it was not about logistics, it was not about safety, it was about something else, something more lasting. And you? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out quieter than the others. What will you remember? For the first time, there was a pause, not long, not dramatic, just enough to feel intentional. And when he answered, his voice was lower than before, more controlled in a way that felt different. That you did not step back, he said, and those words settled into me in a way I was not prepared for, because they were not about power, not about control, they were about choice, my choice, the one moment in all of this that had belonged entirely to me. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed with everything that had been said, but because I understood it, because I could see the shape of it now, the way my life would continue on the surface unchanged, but underneath something fundamental had shifted, something I would carry whether I wanted to or not. I stood, then my movements steady, even though everything inside me still felt slightly off balance. Then I go home, I said, and it was both a statement and a test, because I needed to hear how he would respond. He held my gaze for a second longer, then gave a single nod. You go home, he confirmed, and just like that the tension in the room shifted again, not gone, but different, like the next phase had already begun. I took a step toward the exit, then paused just long enough to look back at him one last time, because it felt necessary, because something in me needed to mark this moment clearly before I left. Thank you, I said quietly, not for the protection, not for the control, just for the one thing that mattered. He did not answer, not with words, but his gaze held mine for a second longer, and somehow that was enough. As I turned and walked toward the door, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. He could control the world around him. He could control what reached me, what touched me, what followed me. But he could not control the moment that started all of this, the moment I chose to stay. And maybe that was why I was still here, because in a world built on power, the only thing that had surprised him was not what I did, but the fact that I did not hesitate. And as the door opened and the night air met me again, I understood that whatever this was, it was not ending, it was just becoming something neither of us could undo.